Two things are true about the last 18 hours. My God, is it only 18? Let's make it three things. They feel like 68 hours. The second is that the Supreme Court is making those decisions we've discussed this hour. They've injected rocket fuel into our ability to talk about and understand the stakes of the 2024 election. Their Chevron ruling paves the way for a second-term Donald Trump presidency to act on the far right's darkest, deepest fantasies. Things like never before, a wholesale top-to-bottom deconstruction of the administrative state. It's what Steve Bannon promised. Deconstruction of our federal government. It's now on the table. It's something they're talking about doing. The Fisher decision ensures that whatever Trump-worshipping entity takes its place will be institutionally more forgiving to those who would invade our Capitol to help him retain power. Again, the stakes are going up as we speak. The third thing that's true about the last 18 hours is that Democrats, in a way they've never done so before, are openly talking to reporters like myself and others about whether President Joe Biden represents their best foot forward to defeat Trump and Trumpism and everything that he threatens. There's one thing, though, that has not changed, not in the last 18 hours or 18 months, and that is the cold, hard, undeniable truth that of the choices we face for November, one candidate instigated a violent insurrection on our democracy. The other did not. He sought to protect the democracy. That, folks, is the choice we have in November. Joining our conversation, former Republican Congressman, MSNBC political analyst David Jolly. Also joining us, MSNBC political analyst, host of the Bulwark podcast, former spokesperson for the RNC, Tim Miller, and professor of history at NYU, author of Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is here. David Jolly, I've tried to set this up and then get out of the way. Your thoughts today?
I think last night changed everything. I think going into yesterday, there was a sustaining argument that this race wasn't about age. It was about ideology. It wasn't about age. It was about leadership. It wasn't about age. It was about fitness. Donald Trump didn't tell us to inject bleach into our veins because he was old. He did it because he's stupid. He didn't get convicted because of his age. He got convicted for fraud. He didn't abandon NATO because of his age. He abandoned NATO because of a lack of leadership. But last night made this race about age, specifically about Joe Biden's age. And I think where Democrats today, from Barack Obama on down, are making the contrast argument in response to what we saw last night, they are fundamentally misreading the room. The American voters who are shocked by last night aren't shocked by the contrast. Many of them missed the contrast. Many people didn't even actually hear what was said between the candidates. They were shocked and saddened by what they saw of their president. And I think that's the coda to all of this, that what they saw last night raised concern not about Democratic nominee Joe Biden, but about their president, about our president. We haven't had a national conversation around a president's age since Ronald Reagan's second term, but we're having it now. And so the contrast arguments that Democrats are making today are important. Perhaps it's the only argument available to them. But the shock and sadness that many Americans are feeling is they don't know how to reconcile this issue now of Joe Biden's age. He's not asking to serve until next January. He's asking to serve until January of 2029. And a lot of Americans are now asking themselves, is that the right decision? Is he the right person for November? Joe Biden has done something nobody else did. He stopped Donald Trump. It's a remarkable service to the country. He has had an incredible first term. He's making the case for a second term. But last night, what landed in people's lap was the president's age, not his ideology, not his policies. Perhaps what we saw in North Carolina today, if replicated, can address that. He can hit it head on. If he is the candidate, that's how Democrats survive the next 4 months. The contrast argument is already in place. The American voters now, at least many of them, are wrestling with their own president's age as a national question, not as a political question. And that's where Democrats, I think, have to address that more head on than they are actually doing today.
Tim Miller.
Well, I appreciate that Representative Jolly said that, because I think that there have been a lot of people that believe that privately but haven't been saying it publicly. I would add to what he said that Joe Biden, in addition to doing the duties of president, in order to save our democracy, because of the stakes that you just laid out, needs to be able to deliver a coherent argument that reaches people about why Donald Trump is so dangerous. And as for the rally today, that's nice. I'm happy that Joe Biden had a good rally this afternoon. But the people that are going to see that is reassuring Democratic partisans that pay attention to politics, that already know the stakes, that watch this show, that understand the threat. The people that watched last night, the 50 million that saw it live, and the 50+ million that are going to see little clips on TikTok and Instagram who don't pay that close of attention, they were not given anything to work with by Joe Biden last night. He did not deliver a single coherent argument against the most unfit person ever to run for any office in this country, Donald Trump. There are plenty of things that he could have attacked Donald Trump on, unlimited. We talk about them here all the time. He wasn't up for doing it. And so when I see the messages from Barack Obama and Bill Clinton and everybody today, they bear no resemblance to the conversations that I'm having with Democratic elected officials who are in office now. None of them think that just Joe Biden is a nice man and Donald Trump is a bad man is good enough. It's true. We all know it's true. I love Joe Biden. I think he's been a good president. But if we're going to save this democracy, we've got to do better than Joe Biden is a good man and Donald Trump's a bad man. We've got to be able to convince the voters that have not yet been convinced that Donald Trump represents an existential threat to this country and that Joe Biden is a better bet. And if Joe Biden isn't capable of making that argument, then we have time. We have about a month to find somebody else who can. And if he is capable of making it, then what we saw in Raleigh today, we need to see over and over and over again in our face, not the same campaign he's been running, more. He needs to prove it to people. And he needs to have a serious conversation with his advisors about how he can prove it to people. Because otherwise, this is just a reality check. I know some people aren't going to be happy to hear this, but like we were losing. Joe Biden was losing before the debate last night. So you can not believe the polls if you want, but in the same polls that Joe Biden is losing in Pennsylvania, Bob Casey, the Democrat, is winning. In the same polls he's losing in Wisconsin, Tammy Baldwin is winning. Why is that? It's not because the polls are rigged. It's because there's a certain set of voters that don't know if Joe Biden's up for it. The debate last night was his opportunity to reassure them. He didn't do it. So he's got to figure out how to do it now, or we've got to figure out a plan B.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.